To other news now, the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund State of the Child report for this year shows the vast majority of our young children are not on track to be properly prepared for school. Around 62% of our children are suffering from what's called multidimensional poverty in terms of money, food, and, of course, educational information. Dr. Linda Ncube-Nkomo is the CEO of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. Dr. Ncube-Nkomo, good afternoon to you. There's so much evidence that our children are being failed in so many ways. You talk about multi-dimensional poverty. How bad is their situation?
The situation is really bad, because when we're talking about multi-dimensional poverty, we're talking about children's access to health, to nutrition, to education, to housing, to proper sanitation, water, about access to information. So when a child has got 3 out of about 7 dimensions of poverty, then they're really not even on the back foot. They're on their back. And when you look at the stats in South Africa, we have got children not just living below the poverty line. We've got children living in the ultra poverty line, meaning that those children are in households whose income for the month is about 367 rand. So you can just imagine, Stephen, with 367 rand to cater for food, to cater for bills, to cater for education, those kids don't even have a chance before they've started.
There's some, we live in a difficult society. I think you know that better than I do. Some interventions we can make. So it's quite difficult to ensure that every child grows up in a house with enough money or enough books. The way that government intervenes, and governments around the world do this, is through schooling. For these young children in particular, we talk about early childhood development centres. People often call them creches as well. Are those interventions working? You talk in your report about the fact that teachers actually aren't often able to do the job that they should do in these centres.
So before we even get a child into those centres, Stephen, there's a couple of building blocks that must be happening within that child's life. That child must be born to a mother that had adequate nutrition while she was expecting the baby. The baby, once born, needs to have adequate nutrition. And if the mother doesn't have adequate nutrition, you've got an underweight baby who is stunted, and that growth, developmental milestones from a physical and cognitive level are going to be probably delayed for the greater part of their lives. So they won't even get into the early learning programs that must take place before they get into ECD. So if they're coming into the ECD sector and all that is there is infrastructure, we've not done enough. We need to make sure that children are coming to school well fed, or else give them the food as soon as they come into the school, and make sure that throughout the course of the day they're getting nutritious snacks and leaving the school having been well fed. Then we can be able to talk about the capacitation of those practitioners, because an ECD practitioner has got to be a trained person that prepares the child for foundational stages of learning. So it can't be somebody who's just looked for a job and brought in to look after children, and we think that they will give the children the right foundation that's required for them academically. So before we get to ECD, let's talk about our children being well fed. And if not, what should the state and the private sector be doing to ensure that children have at least access to a decent, nutritious meal every single day?
The Eastern Cape section of the Human Rights Commission suggested to us last week that there are 2 big interventions they would make, and they were talking about the fact that around 100 children, it's a greater number than that, died literally from starvation in the Eastern Cape in just 1 year. And they suggested 2 big things. One would be to increase the child support grant, and the other, I think very much agreeing with you on this, would be to enlarge the school nutrition programs to include children before school-going age. So ECDs, but I think maybe we need to create a situation where there's free food for every child somehow. I don't know how we would do that. Would you support those interventions?
I would, absolutely. And the data, those numbers are always understated. So like you've already said, that's just the numbers that were reported. We would support interventions. In fact, we are currently supporting an intervention that has been run by child activists to say to retailers, top-tier nutrition-dense foods take away your margin so that the grant that's being given to families can at least buy those foods so that children can have the protein levels that they require in order to be able to at least have a fighting chance from a growth perspective. So most definitely we would support those interventions.
The child support grant is probably the biggest intervention that we make, really. How important is that? And I know there's a big conversation in our society around basic income grants and other grants. People need those. But I would imagine in terms of investment in the future, the child support grant must go very far.
It does. Well, Stephen, think about what you and I pay for food. And recipients of child support grants pay the same amount for a loaf of bread that we would pay for a loaf of bread. So I think we really need to get to a state where we can, with dignity though, without dehumanizing people, be able to cut the profit, like I said, that retailers make on certain foods, and then the recipients of the grant be almost given a loyalty card that enables them to buy the food at a price that's got zero profit on it, so that children can be adequately nourished. Otherwise, that child support grant must cover so many things. And in a lot of instances, the ECD fee may not even be covered by the child support grant. So we need to now start thinking creatively what we're going to do to build a pipeline of children that have got a fighting chance of being responsible, capable citizens that can participate economically in the building and the growth of our country.
In 1994, my understanding is that roughly 1/3 of our children, as high as 30% or so, were stunted. In other words, hadn't received enough food when they were young. And that percentage very slowly came down to sort of the low 20s just before the pandemic. After that, it seems to me that things suddenly got dramatically worse. Is that what you see?
That's exactly what we saw. And what we also saw is that the pandemic led to households losing income. So people lost jobs during the pandemic. And that obviously would have an effect on the ability of those households to then provide food for the home, for the families, ultimately for the children. So we definitely did see that as well.
Dr. Linda Ncube-Nkomo, thank you, CEO of the Nelson Mandela Children's Fund. Really do appreciate the time. Very disturbing report. I'm sure it's available for you online.